What was once free from the forest has been replaced by a tube of synthetic caulk that cracks again within 2 winters. Every barn, shed, and timber frame built before the last century relied on something you could gather from a single tree. And most people walking past that same tree today have no idea it holds a repair that outlasts anything sold in a hardware shop. Somewhere along the way, the companies making synthetic wood fillers and silicone sealants had every reason to make sure nobody remembered that a jar of melted tree resin could do the same job for free and do it better. A product that never wears out does not get repeat customers. So the knowledge of how to make and use pine pitch quietly stopped being taught, not because it stopped working, but because it stopped being profitable to teach. What you are about to hear is not folklore, and it is not a theory someone dreamed up for the internet. This is a method that held together ships, barns, and church roofs across entire centuries, in places where a failed seal meant a flooded hold or a frozen family, and it still works exactly the same way today. Pine pitch begins with the resin that a pine tree produces to seal its own wounds. When bark is cut or a branch breaks, the tree pushes out a thick, sticky sap to close the gap and keep out insects and rot, which is the very same job you are about to ask it to do for your timber. Traditionally, this resin was gathered by making a shallow diagonal cut into the bark of a living pine, low on the trunk, just deep enough to reach the resin channels without harming the tree, and letting the sap slowly weep into a container fixed below the cut. A single healthy pine can be tapped gently over a season without lasting harm, the same way a maple is tapped for syrup. An old countryside habit was never to strip a tree bare, only to take what it could spare. If you do not want to tap a living tree, you do not have to. Pine forests are full of hardened lumps of resin on fallen branches, old stumps, and storm-damaged trunks, and this weathered resin works just as well once it has been cleaned and remelted. Keep watching, because the difference between resin that fails in a year and resin that lasts a lifetime comes down entirely to what happens in the next 2 steps, and most people skip both of them. Raw resin straight from the tree is never ready to use on its own. It carries bark fragments, dead insects, pine needles, and grit, and if you seal a crack with that debris still inside it, the patch will crumble the first time the wood shifts. The traditional method was to warm the raw resin gently in a pot set inside a larger pot of simmering water, what is sometimes called a water bath, rather than placing it directly over a flame, because pine resin is genuinely flammable and can scorch or even flare if it gets too hot too quickly. As the resin softens and turns liquid, you pour it slowly through a cloth, an old piece of muslin, or a fine metal strainer. This filtered resin is what old timber framers and shipwrights called clean pitch, and it is the base of everything that follows. You will notice it hardens again quickly once it cools, which is exactly why the next step matters. Because pure hardened resin on its own is brittle, and brittle is the enemy of any wood that moves with the seasons. This next part is where most people get it wrong, because they assume pure resin is the finished product, when really it is only half of one. Wood breathes, it expands in damp weather and contracts in dry weather, and any crack you fill needs to move with it, not fight against it, which is precisely why synthetic caulks fail on old timber. They cure hard and rigid, while the wood around them keeps flexing until the seal splits. The traditional fix for this was to blend the filtered pine resin with 2 other ingredients, melted beeswax and a small amount of fine wood ash or sawdust. Beeswax, worked into the hot resin, at roughly 1 part wax to 3 or 4 parts resin, keeps the mixture flexible, even in cold weather, stopping it from turning glass hard and cracking under pressure. A pinch of fine ash, or very fine sawdust, stirred in at the end, gives the mixture body so it grips instead of simply oozing, and helps it set into a firmer, more workable paste, rather than staying as thin as syrup. This 3-part blend, pine, resin, beeswax, and a little ash, is close to what was historically known in parts of Scandinavia and Northern Europe as pine tar wax, and versions of it were used across centuries of timber construction. Wherever softwood forests met a hard winter, stay with me, because once this mixture is ready, the way you apply it changes depending on exactly what you are repairing. And getting that part right is what makes the seal last decades instead of months. For a crack running along a structural beam or an old timber frame joint, the wood first needs to be clean and dry, with any loose splinters or old failed filler picked out by hand so the pitch has raw wood to bond to rather than dust. The warm pitch mixture, kept liquid over your water bath, is worked into the crack with a stiff, narrow tool. An old butter knife or a purpose-shaped wooden spatula works just as well as anything bought new, pressing it down into the depth of the gap rather than simply smearing it across the surface. Deep or wide gaps benefit from doing this in 2 or 3 thin layers rather than one thick one, letting each layer cool and firm slightly before the next goes in, because a single thick pour can shrink unevenly as it cools and pull away from the sides of the crack. Once the final layer is level with the surface of the wood, it can be smoothed with a warm blade or even a gloved thumb. And here is where a small caution matters. The mixture stays hot enough to mark skin for longer than you expect, so a cloth or thin glove between your hand and the pitch is simply good sense, not overcome. Left to cool naturally, without rushing it with cold water, the pitch sets into a dense, slightly flexible seal that moves with the timber rather than against it. The same approach works just as well on old fence posts, gate hinges, and any exposed timber joint where rain finds its way in and rot begins. Because the principle is identical everywhere, seal the gap with something that flexes, not something that fights the wood. Tool handles deserve their own mention here, because this is where the method proves itself fastest. An axe handle, or a hoe shaft that has developed a hairline crack near the head, is usually thrown out today, but that same crack, cleaned and worked full of warm pitch mixture, then wrapped tightly with cord while it cools and left to set overnight, will often outlast the rest of the handle. Roofing is where this method carries some of its longest and best documented history. Wooden roof shingles, particularly on churches and outbuildings across Scandinavia, were traditionally coated and recoated with pine tar for protection against rot and weather. And there are wooden stave churches in Norway still standing after more than 800 years. Their timber preserved largely through generations of exactly this kind of pine tar maintenance. That is not a folk claim passed around for effect. It is a documented, well-known fact of Scandinavian building history. And it tells you plainly that this is not a method being proposed for the first time. It is a method being remembered, applied thinly and worked into the grain rather than layered on thick. The same pitch and wax blend can protect and seal small sections of exposed roof timber, fence caps, or shed boards from water ingress, extending the life of wood that would otherwise soften and rot within a handful of seasons. The second thing most people are surprised by is just how long this seal lasts once it is properly cured, because the mixture flexes with the wood instead of resisting it. A well-made pitch repair on an interior beam or a sheltered timber joint can remain sound for many years, without needing attention, while synthetic caulks, in the same conditions, are often already showing hairline splits within 18 months, simply because they were never designed to move. Outdoor applications, exposed to full weather, naturally need more attention than sheltered indoor timber, and a light reapplication every few years, simply warming a little more pitch mixture and working it over any thin or worn patches. Keeps the seal working indefinitely, the same way old barns were maintained generation after generation, not through replacement, but through small, regular care. If you are storing extra pitch mixture for future use, it keeps almost indefinitely in a sealed tin, kept somewhere dry and away from direct heat, ready to be softened again in a water bath whenever the next crack needs attention. There is something worth sitting with. Once you have made a batch of this yourself and watched it set into a wood-colored seal that already looks like it has always belonged there, we got used to thinking that repairing something properly meant buying the right product, when for most of human history it meant understanding the material well enough to help it heal itself. Pine pitch does not fight the wood, it moves with it, because it comes from the same forest, shaped by the same weather. And there is a kind of quiet sense in that which no synthetic tube of filler was ever built to have. None of this knowledge was ever truly lost. It was simply left on the shelf, while something more convenient to sell took its place. And it is still sitting there in every pine forest, waiting for anyone patient enough to use it. If this has been useful to you, there are more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day. The old ways are still here. You only have to know where to look. If you try this on an old beam, a gate post, or a tool handle that has been cracked for years, I would genuinely like to know how long it has been holding since you sealed it. So tell me in the comments how many seasons your pitch repair has lasted.